address this distinguished gathering at HORIZONE 2.0. Now, I begin with a simple question. What will define the great university and the research institutions of the 21st century? As just now, Professor Karras has talked about AI and sustainable development. So, if we think that how the great university and the research institutions of the world are going to be in the 21st century, will it be the larger campuses or the cut-edging laboratories or maybe the growing number of publications, or will it be something very profound, that is the ability to bring together the diverse disciplines to solve the humanity's greatest challenges? So I believe that the answer lies in the last of these. As we have seen that India has celebrated the idea that knowledge flourishes through openness. It flourishes through dialogue and the free exchange of ideas. So this timeless wisdom, I can see from how it is expressed in Rig Vedas. Ano Brahadra Kratavo Yantu Vishvate. That is, let the noble thoughts come to us from every direction. So more than 3 millennia later, these words, which I have taken from Rig Veda, they remain remarkably relevant today. They remind us that wisdom is not confined within the boundaries of a single discipline, single institution, or a single nation. The more transformative ideas that emerge, they emerge when the different perspectives that converge, that is the whole idea, and that's the space that we got together to hear experts from different disciplines across the globe. So long before the modern world embraced interdisciplinarity, Indian philosophy recognized that progress depends on our willingness to learn from each other. In many ways, this ancient insight of Rig Veda, the very essence of today's theme, the future of interdisciplinary research, that is bridging law, economics, and public policy for sustainable development. Now, this is the roadmap for today. So, ladies and gentlemen, today we meet at a defining moment in our human history. Never before has humanity possessed such extraordinary scientific capability, technological innovation, and access to knowledge, as Professor has pointed out in his previous presentation. Yet never before we confronted challenges of such complexity and interconnectedness. Climate change threatens the ecosystems, livelihoods, and artificial intelligence is transforming economies, workplaces, and the legal systems. The COVID pandemic has reminded us of our shared vulnerability. We have seen the rising inequalities, cyber threats, migration, food insecurity, resource scarcity that increasingly translate geographical and political boundaries. These are not merely environmental challenges. They are not merely economic challenges. They are not merely technological challenges. They are fundamentally human challenges. And human challenges rarely arrive wearing disciplinary labels. Climate change cannot be solved by environmental science alone. AI cannot be governed by technology alone. Inclusive growth cannot be achieved through economics alone. Effective public policy that cannot succeed without sound legal institutions, economic understanding, and social insight. So, the defining challenges of our century requires a new way of thinking, and that moves beyond academic silos, and that requires collaboration across the disciplines. So, the future will not belong to disciplines which are working in isolation, but it belongs to the disciplines working in collaboration. So, we need to appreciate how interdisciplinary research has become indispensable. And we must first understand the defining challenge that confronts humanity today, that is the pursuit of sustainable development. So, if there is one idea that comes to define this century, that idea is sustainable development. For decades, for many, all the nations measured progress primarily through economic indicators like GDP, industrialization, rising incomes. I understand these are important, but experiences has taught us that economic growth does not guarantee human well-being. Prosperity loses its meaning if it is accompanied by widening inequalities, environmental degradation, institutional fragility, or social exclusion. So, this realization found its most influential expression in the Brundtland Commission's report, Our Common Future, which defined sustainable development that take care of present as well as the future generation. It was simple yet transformative idea that continues to shape the global policy. Today, the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals have translated this vision into a shared global agenda, as Professor has pointed out in his slides, from poverty eradication to quality education, gender equity, climate action, strong institutions. All of these goals, they remind that development is not a collection of isolated objectives, but it's an interconnected mission. And that's the defining characteristic of this age that we are in. For a minute, let's talk about climate change, which we can look from look as environmental concern, or maybe it affects food security, public health, migration, economic productivity, insurance market, international law, what not. I will not talk about artificial intelligence, as sir has already covered. But if we take financial inclusion, it's not merely an economic objective. It depends on legal identity, digital infrastructures, consumer protections, public policy, technological innovations, institutional trust. So each of these challenges crosses the boundaries of disciplines because the real world itself is interconnected, globalized. And that reminds me of Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, that development is ultimately about expanding people's freedom and capabilities, not merely increasing the GDP or the national income of the country. So, sustainable development is not simply about how the economies they are growing, but it is about creating the societies where prosperity, justice, environmental stewardship, and human dignity, they all advance together. This understanding compels us to rethink not only what we research, but how we conduct that research. That is very important. If the problems that we seek to solve are interconnected, can our research continue to remain in silos, fragmented? Can universities organize around disciplinary silos, can address the challenges that refuse to respect those very boundaries? I believe they cannot. The future belongs to those who are willing to cross intellectual frontiers, collaborate across disciplines, and integrate diverse perspectives of knowledge in pursuit of meaningful solutions. Here you see that again, so now it's a time from moving from disciplinary excellence to interdisciplinary thinking. For centuries, universities have organized themselves around departments or maybe disciplines. Law trained lawyers, economics trained economists, medicines trained doctors, engineering trained engineers. But this structure served humanity remarkably well. It enabled deep specialization, generated extraordinary discoveries, and it also laid the foundation of modern science, technology, medicine, governance. Indeed, every discipline has its own intellectual traditions, methods, ways of understanding the world. That I'm not denying. Specialization, of course, remains the cornerstone of academic excellence. Yet, the British scientist and novelist C.P. Snow observed in a celebrated lecture on the two cultures, knowledge had gradually become fragmented. Scholars often spoke fluently within their own disciplines, but they struggled to engage meaningfully with those outside them. The result was not merely an academic divide, it was a limitation on collective ability to solve the society's more pressing problems. Because the world, after all, does not organize itself into university departments. Just think of a farmer who is confronting climate change. It does not experience it as an environmental issue in the morning or economic issue in the noon or a legal issue in the evening. Or a policymaker for that matter regulating AI cannot separate technology from ethics, from economics, from governance, from law. So, likewise, a citizen who is seeking justice, healthcare, or financial security encounters these realities as interconnected experiences, not as isolated disciplines. So, this realization, it gave rise to a new way of thinking, that is the interdisciplinary research, which does not replace the disciplines, but it builds the bridge between the gap. It respects the depth of the specialized knowledge while recognizing the today's grand challenges, which requires the collaboration and partnership among the different fields. The Nobel laureate Ostrom demonstrated in pioneering work on the governance of common resources. Professor showed that sustainable solutions They emerge not from single, but the combined or insights from different disciplines and community engagement. So their work teaches us a valuable lesson that the complex problems, they demands an integrated thinking. That's the key. And this idea is best captured by timeless Indian insight, Ekam Sada Vipra Bahuda Vadanti. Truth is one, the wise describe it in many ways. So, the objective is therefore not to diminish the disciplinary excellence, but to enrich it through dialogue, collaboration, and mutual learning, for which today we have gathered here. Now, being an economist in a law school, law and economics have historically eyed each other with some suspicion. Economists have sometimes treated law as black box, a set of exogenous rules to be modeled rather than understood. Lawyers, they have treated economic reasoning as reductive, as though every question of justice can be flattened into a cost benefit spreadsheet. Both suspicions contain a grain of truth, and both, I would agree, and are ultimately unproductive. Because here you see that how both the disciplines, they interact with each other, and they are important, as Justice Sikri in his judgment on Shiv Shakti Sugar versus Renuka Sugar has also highlighted that it's a high time that lawyers and economists must reduce the gap between the two disciplines. Because as on one hand, economics gives law a predictive discipline, it forces us to ask not only what a rule says, but what a rule can cause people to think. Law gives economics an institutional discipline. It forces us to ask how an optimal in principle policy can be made binding, monitored, and enforced with real institutions with their capacity constraint and political pressure. So, if I take an example of a carbon tax, which is economically elegant and legally sound, is still worth nothing if no regulator has the administrative capacity to collect it, or if it collapses the moment if it meets political resistance. So that's why bridging law, economics, and public policy is not an academic luxury. It is the route by which sustainable development moves from a diagnosis in a research paper to an obligation that changes behavior on the ground, from seminar room to the river bank, the factory floor, and the farmer's field. Now, so if we look at India's journey towards the sustainable development, India's development trajectory has never had the luxury of sequencing growth first and sustainability second, the way much of the industrialized world did. It is urbanizing, industrializing, greening its energy mix all once under the shadow of a climate crisis it did comparatively little to cause, but nonetheless helped solve. Indian courts recognize this balancing act early, and in doing so, gave the country some of the clearest jurisprudence on sustainable development. For example, in Valour Citizen Welfare Forum versus Union of India, Supreme Court held that the precautionary principle and the polluter pay principle are essential features of sustainable development, which place the burden of proof on industry to demonstrate that its activities are environmentally benign and read sustainable development into the right to life under Article 21. So that's the legal system doing exactly the translation work I described a moment ago, taking an idea which is born into economics and international policy debate and converting it into a justifiable, enforceable domestic doctrine. So that same complex timeline has forced a distinctly Indian model of institutional experimentation elsewhere too, ambitious renewable energy targets that pursued alongside continued reliance on coal for energy security, a regulatory landscape from Jan Vishwas Act's decriminalization of environmental offenses to evolving frameworks on data protection and labor codification. That is still working on how deterrence, growth, and compliance cost should be balanced, and a judiciary and regulatory state that are in real time learning to speak the language of economics without losing the discipline of law. So what India's journey demonstrates, I think, is that sustainable development is not a destination any country, be it developed or developing, has actually reached. It's a continuous act of institutional recalibration, adjusting law in light of what economics tell us about behavior, adjusting economic policy in light of what science tells about planetary limits, adjusting both in light of what public policy tell us is actually implementable in a country of India's scale and diversity. If India gets this right, it will not merely have solved its own developmental puzzle, it will have offered the rest of the world a working template on how law, economics, public policy can be bridged under real constraints at real scale. So let me draw these threads together and I will conclude as I have a meeting at 3 o'clock. The challenges before us, as I believe has been discussed in the opening session and the keynote as well. So whatever the challenges the world is facing today of climate change, AI, financial exclusion, institutional fragility, they do not respect the boundaries of our departments, our degrees, or our discipline. They demand researchers, institutions, policymakers willingly to think as the Rig Veda urged, at the outset in ways that let the noble thoughts come from every discipline. I will close with one further line from Maha-Upanishad that has guided Indian thought on our shared interconnected fate for millennia and which speaks as much to disciplines as it does to nations. Udar Charitanam tu Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam. That is, for those of noble conduct, the whole world is but one family. So, to conclude, law, economics, public policy are not rival claimants to the truth about development. They are each in their own idiom describing the same family, the same shared inheritance, and the same obligations to the generation who will inherit after us. Thank you all. Sorry, because of the time constraint, I had to finish my presentation here. Thank you so much. I have meetings, so I'm so sorry, Professor. I have to take your leave.